Hello everyone, good evening and welcome to another session of Karwaan Online History Festival Season 2. Today I am honored and delighted to have Dr. Tripurdaman Singh sir with us this evening to speak on his book, The 60 Stormy Days, the story of the first amendment to the Constitution of India. To give a small introduction of Sir, though it won't do justice to his achievements, he is a historian, writer, public speaker who works on the political and social history of early modern and modern South Asia. He splits his time between Agra, India, which is his hometown, and London, United Kingdoms, and these days he's in Awadh, Lucknow, where he's currently a British Academy Postdoctoral Fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, University of London. As a historian, he is particularly interested in no particular order, Rajput history, the decline of the Mughal Empire, the early British Empire in India, the princely states, independence and the transfer of power, the writing of the constitution and the birth of Indian democracy, and post-liberalization politics in India. He is also interested in histories of colonial sports, fashion, clothing, and aesthetics, as well as broader themes of sovereignty, state formation, colonial identity, modernity, and constitutionalism. Today he is going to narrate the reviving story of the First Amendment to the Constitution of India, one of the pivotal events in Indian political and constitutional history, and its first great battle of ideas. Passed in June 1951 in the face of tremendous opposition within and outside Parliament, the subject of some of independent India's fiercest parliamentary debates, the First Amendment drastically curbed freedom of speech and enabled caste-based reservation by restricting freedom against discrimination, circumscribed the right to property and validated abolition of zamindari system, and fashioned a special schedule of unconstitutional laws immune to judicial challenges. So without further ado, I would like to give Dr. Tripurdaman Singh the floor to take it forward. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ishan, for such a generous introduction, and thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be able to talk to all of you, and I wanted to start basically by giving a brief outline of why I wrote the book, and then I will kind of cover the sort of major events that the book runs through, and then give you a sort of brief overview of my arguments. So to begin, the reason that I wrote the book was because I think firstly it speaks to the present in many ways, in terms of the political scenario where you have one figure and one party sort of dominant in the political sphere, in terms of the kind of questions over democracy, the constitution, sedition, etc., that are being raised in public discourse, and also in the kind of very foundational constitutional questions that we ourselves are now confronted with. Secondly, I think one of the reasons that I wrote it was because the story is so counterintuitive in terms of how it reflects on the kind of major figures, founding figures of the Indian Republic: Nehru, Patel, Ambedkar, Mukherjee, etc. And in many ways, it kind of inverts the binaries that we have often been led to believe. Binaries, whether they are between liberal and authoritarian visions of India, between left and right, or even between Nehru and Mukherjee and the RSS. And the story kind of inverts the binaries, and it kind of helps us understand that history is not told in this kind of Manichaean black and white terms. And lastly, I think my last reason for writing this book was because it's such a sort of pivotal moment in Indian political and constitutional history, and there's hardly been any any major work on it, and so I felt it was deserving of its own space in historiography. So those were the kind of main reasons that I wrote this book. And now I'll kind of give you a quick overview of the major events. So the book opens with the Constitution having come into force on 26 January 1950. It is the result of close to 4 years of deliberation and debate in the Constituent Assembly, and more or less universal consensus on its provisions. So it comes into force on 26 January. Very famously, Dr. Ambedkar describes the provisions of fundamental rights as the heart and soul of the Constitution, and it is believed across the board that the chapter on fundamental rights essentially forms a kind of dividing line between a repressive colonial past and what is going to be a liberal, free, democratic, republican future. And that is believed across the board, from figures like Nehru to Patel, but also towards the right, towards Mukherjee, the RSS, etc. So that's a very commonly held belief. Very quickly, however, things start to unravel, and the initial trigger, of course, comes from the case of the communist detainees in Bombay, and then the communist detainees in Madras, and those cases reach the high courts, where the courts, of course, uphold the right to liberty, and those detainees are released, and of course preventive detention is quashed, which leads back to the government of India going back to the drawing board, drafting a new Preventive Detention Act. But it becomes quite clear with these cases that the courts are not going to be a walkover, and the Constitution is now a potent force. And a very good book on the use of the Constitution by ordinary citizens is by the historian Rohit Day, published by Princeton University Press. So anyway, the Constitution becomes a kind of weapon in the hands of the citizenry to be used to, in some ways, protect them against overreach by the state. And it becomes very clear with these cases that the courts are going to, quite vigorously uphold constitutional provisions. And the real test comes within months when, in two cases with the Supreme Court, one to deal with the Pre Censorship Orders passed against the newspaper, the news magazine, The Organizer, which is a publication of the RSS, which had been criticizing government policy over Pakistan and Bengal, where there had been large-scale migration from East Bengal, courtesy communal violence, and another left-leaning magazine called Crossroads, which had been criticizing the government's policy of repression towards the communist rebellion in the erstwhile Madras presidency. So both cases reach the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court overturns the ban on Crossroads, and it quashes the pre-censorship orders on the Organizer. In both cases, the aim of the government had been both to restrict the flow of information, so restrict circulation of the Crossroads in the Madras and Bombay presidencies, and censor the kind of information that was being brought out by the organizers to make it conform to the government's viewpoint. In both cases, the Supreme Court quashed government orders, and crucially, they overturned the legislation on which these orders were based, which was the various public safety and public security acts in Delhi and in Madras and in Bombay. So the government by this kind of lost a crucial tool in their legal armory, and the courts, I mean, they affirmed a very core principle of the Constitution, which was that unless the threat was of such a magnitude that the very security of the state was threatened, the government could not restrict the freedom of speech. So that was a huge victory for and widely acclaimed victory for the votaries of fundamental rights, and a kind of huge destruction of the government's legal armory. And then Patel very famously told Nehru, the floor has fallen out of our ability to control the press. And of course, the press welcomed this victory by carrying on to vigorously defend its right to criticize the government and hold it to account. Next, the kind of action moved to UP and Bihar, where zamindari abolition legislation was being drafted. Interestingly, Bihar and UP take diametrically opposite routes to zamindari abolition. UP takes its time, drafts like a mammoth, I think 340 odd articles in the UP Zamindari Abolition Act, which calls for uniform rates of compensation, plenty of mechanisms for support grants for smaller zamindars, and basically they put in a lot of effort into making sure that they don't try to contravene the quite strict right to property provisions in the Constitution. Bihar, on the other hand, takes a different kind of route. And in Bihar, it's the Zamindari Abolition Act is rushed through. They have a very different style of compensation mechanisms, where the amount of compensation or the rate of compensation paid varies according to the amount of land that the zamindar owns. And so obviously both bills become the subjects of litigation on two counts. In Bihar, there's of course both the right to property and also the right to equality, because people within a certain class are being meted out with differing treatment based on what is a completely arbitrary sort of arbitrary method. So both cases kind of wind their way through the high courts in Bihar and in UP. Famously, the Bihar High Court, the Patna High Court, strikes down the Bihar Zamindari abolition legislation, not on the grounds of right to property, but on the grounds that it contravenes the right to equality by treating members within a certain class on differing parameters. So the basic observation is that there's no adequate reason behind why someone whose annual income is 20,000 rupees should be given compensation at the rate of 20 times his income, and somebody who earns 20,001 rupee being given compensation perhaps at 8 times his annual income. So on that basis, the Zamindari Abolition Act is struck down as ultra-virus of the legislature and violative of the Constitution, and that kind of brings a very important question to the head. So for the Congress Party, this was a huge deal, and it was a huge deal because this was a core principle for the party and a core part of their socioeconomic agenda. And so in Bihar, it leads to a huge counter-reaction, where the Bihar government demands a sort of constitutional amendment to tide over their troubles. In the center, the Nehru government is sympathetic to the Bihar cause, but they choose to wait and watch, as to what happens in UP, even though it's quite clear that and this is made clear by several figures, including the President Rajendra Prasad, that it's relatively straightforward to bring the Bihar Act into conformity with the Constitution rather than going in for potentially far-reaching constitutional amendment. And this view is kind of strengthened when the Allahabad High Court gives its judgment, which holds the Uttar Pradesh Act valid and dismisses the suits of some 4,000 zamindars. So the Allahabad judgment basically makes clear that there is no existential threat to zamindari abolition as a principle, and well-drafted and well-crafted zamindari abolition legislation would be upheld by the High Courts. In fact, the Allahabad High Court judgment quite strongly affirms the principle of zamindari abolition. And the third major series of cases comes to be the case in Madras, which revolves around the idea of caste and community-based reservations in educational institutions and government employment. Now, Madras used to have quite peculiar systems of affirmative action created by something called a communal general order, which gave quite strict quotas to certain categories in both in admissions to educational institutions and in government employment. Now, these quotas were fixed to the extent that people could not cross these boundaries. So they were fixed in a ratio which was, so if you had, I think the ratio was, it was drawn out of like 12 or 13. And so if 3 seats out of every 12 were reserved for a particular category of persons, those persons were only eligible for that particular category, which of course made things very, very difficult for the vast majority of applicants. And one of these applicants, somebody who didn't actually apply but wanted to apply for a seat in a medical college, finally approached the Madras High Court demanding that her caste identity not be held against her in the matter of admissions. And this again became a sort of lightning rod for political opinion in the South, because Madras had been a kind of crucible for social justice politics. Reservations and community-based quotas had a quite long history, and of course both the Justice Party, later the DK, the Dravidar Kazhagam, led by Periyar, and crucially the Congress itself, were committed to the idea of community-based quotas. So there was, politically, it was a very, very crucial point for the Congress. It was, again, like zamindari abolition, a sort of pillar of their socioeconomic agenda. And the Madras High Court found caste-based quotas to be violative of crucially the right to equality, but also the right to freedom from discrimination. And so these quotas were struck down, which led to huge protests in Madras, and again persistent demands from the Madras government for a constitutional amendment. So all of these 3 things kind of came back to something that Nehru, repeatedly stressed, which was that these were crucial components of the Congress Party's manifesto. These were promises that the Congress had been making for a long, long time, and as someone like Granville Austin has shown in his work, this comprised what was the kind of the progressive strand of the Constitution. So Austin uses a term called the seamless web, and this sort of social progressivism was one of the strands of Granville Austin's seamless web, and possibly the strongest of the three strands. So for the Congress, this became a kind of existential question. Where does their social agenda square up with their commitment to the Constitution? And so there's a slow build-up of pressure on the central government. The first, of course, happens with the cases over freedom of speech. The second happens with zamindari abolition, and then the kind of third sort of trigger comes with the Madras High Court judgment on reservations. So there's a slow build-up of pressure on the Congress Party in light of the fact that they have to go in for elections. The first inaugural general election was then being planned for the summer of 1951. With all of these things happening, the Congress sort of units in these states, in Madras, in Bihar, crucially also in Punjab, which had seen a kind of expanding conflict between the Congress and the Akali Dal, where another important case sort of came to a head, where Akali Dal leader Master Tara Singh, a very sort of prominent Congress critic, had been jailed on charges of sedition. And in Tara Singh's case, the High Court the Punjab High Court releases Tara Singh, and it crucially holds the section 124A of the Indian Penal Code, which deals with the crime of sedition, to be unconstitutional, because in its reasoning, as long as it can be used to charge people who are advocating dissent from government policy, short of threatening the foundations of the state. In that case, it has to be held to be completely and wholly unconstitutional. So, of course, in all of these three provisions, three provinces, Congress units find themselves on the back foot because they are unable to deliver what they see as core parts of their socioeconomic agenda, something that they have been promising people for years, especially with zamindari abolition. They had like a huge mass contact program, and when it's threatened by the judiciary in Bihar, it actually falls through a Supreme Court, through a High Court judgment. It leads to a situation where there is, in large sections of the Congress, a kind of panic about how they're going to approach the people without having fulfilled the promises they've been making for so many years. And crucially, when the matter kind of comes up to the central government, Prime Minister Nehru is in sympathy with this view. So there is these provinces kind of obstruct the preparations for the general election, despite Prime Minister Nehru's constant sort of appeals to be ready to have elections by the summer of 1951. We find that enough obstructions are created that general elections are postponed, and then as these questions gather steam, Nehru himself comes around to the view that the Constitution cannot be allowed to stand in the way of what he sees as the kind of social progressivist element of the Congress agenda. Crucially, many others in the Congress share, or at least many others in the cabinet share Nehru's view that the constitution as a sort of tool for social progress trumps the idea of the constitution as a sort of tool for democratic propriety, or as a sort of defender of the rights and liberties of individual citizens. So once there's a kind of slow build-up where Nehru tries to bring his colleagues and his chief ministers on board. So he writes to them often saying, we can't have a situation where the constitution comes in our way, comes in the way of the urges of the age. He keeps saying, at one point he makes a statement, we've made these promises to the people, we can't go back now and say that the constitution has come in our way, so we can't fulfill them. And so ultimately Nehru himself is in sympathy with this view that their commitment to the Congress manifesto and their commitment to their socio-economic agenda trumps any sort of commitment to both democratic propriety, but also to the idea of fundamental rights and individual freedom. So finally, the decision to have a constitutional amendment is taken. B.R. Ambedkar is directed to prepare the amendment, and the government crucially keeps it under wraps. So Nehru goes to address for example, the general body meeting of the All India Newspaper Editors Conference, where he makes the case that media freedom is something that he holds dear, but again, he cryptically informs them that such freedom cannot exist without parallel, obligations. He criticizes the media at several points, basically stating in a nutshell that they're spreading fake news, that they're undermining the morale of the armed forces, that something needs to be done about the tone and tenor of the press. He's particularly upset over criticism of his policy towards Pakistan in public by elements. I mean, some elements, of course, associated with the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha, but also by other figures, and broadly by in the vernacular press across the board in Bengal. He confesses to B.C. Roy that they have to put up with a lot of things, courtesy the fact that the judges have read the Constitution in a particular way. He, of course, is shaken by sort of high-profile resignations from his cabinet through the year of 1950. Again, all of these people become Nehru critics. They include Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, but they also include a ostensibly more neutralist figure such as John Mathai, and Nehru suspects that this sort of open criticism of his Pakistan policy is meant to drive him towards some form of military action against Pakistan, something that he does not want to do. And so over the course of the year, he himself comes around to sympathizing with the sort of state units which are feeding the pinch as well. So finally, the amendment comes into the public domain in the early part of 1951, or at least the government's intention to amend the Constitution comes into public domain. It triggers a sort of avalanche of criticism by opposition figures, such as not just Tara Singh, but also more liberal-minded figures like Hridaynath Kunzru, and of course socialist critics like Jayaprakash Narayan, and of course from sort of out-and-out opponents such as Shyam Prasad Mukherjee. And then in the build-up to the parliamentary session, Nehru attempts to corral opinion within the Congress party. He writes to his chief ministers, addressing them, telling them why a constitutional amendment is necessary. And then, of course, criticism in the press continues, but also it's taken up by certain organs of civil society, bar associations, and individual lawyers, but also individual figures of public standing, people such as Boris Mehta, people such as M.R. Jayakar, people such as the famous lawyer P.R. Das, and of course everyone gears up for a kind of quite what is seen to be coming as quite a stormy parliamentary session, where the amendment is presented in Parliament. Nehru lays out, coming into Parliament, Nehru lays out his reasons for the constitutional amendment. He, of course, famously describes fundamental rights as sort of obsolete remnants of things that were thought of during the French and American revolutions. Again, this is terminology he uses repeatedly, and his speech is, I refer to lengthy portions of his speech in my book. I won't really repeat that here, but the debate is fierce because immediately after Nehru finishes speaking, he's replied to by the unofficial leader of the opposition, Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, and by several other figures, and the sort of what I call the first battle of Indian liberalism is taken up. It's very interesting to see the actual debate, because to compare the standards of parliamentary debate in 1951 with the standards of parliamentary debate now, there's a huge difference. The standard of debate in 1951 is exceptionally high, so the back and forth between S.P. Mukherjee and Nehru takes up a lot of time. Mukherjee's replies to Nehru, they're worth reading in the original if anyone can, but they trigger rounds of applause. Famously, Professor N.G. Ranga, then a Congress leader from Andhra Pradesh, later to become one of the founding figures of the Swatantra Party, famously describes Mukherjee as the Indian Burke, after the British parliamentarian and philosopher, and he famously kind of gushes and says, I began to think what the British Parliament must have thought when Burke was reading out his great eloquence. So Mukherjee's speech has a huge effect, and the support for the bill, even within the Congress, seems to be initially lukewarm, because Thakur Das Bhargav and N.G. Ranga, who speak after, offer kind of a very limited defense of the bill. But a sort of quite large parliamentary committee has been created to examine the bill, and the bill goes through the first reading and goes into the committee stage relatively easily. Within the committee, again, there are several opposition members who write minutes of dissent. When it comes out of the committee stage, the parliamentary committee produces an 18-page report on the bill. 2 pages are by Congress members, and the other 16 pages are minutes of dissent produced by opposition members. Famously, again, they attack the bill basically on, both on procedural and on the grounds of content. So there are kind of 4 basic criticisms that I really see. One is kind of the idea that a provisional parliament still yet to face a general election. So it's a provisional parliament elected on a very limited franchise, which is amending the constitution. So a lot of people see this as sort of improper, and on the grounds of kind of democratic propriety, they oppose the passage of the amendment. There are others who oppose it basically on the basis that very little time has elapsed between the creation of the constitution and the government's desire to amend it. They don't think that amending constitution less than 1.5 years since its formation reflects well on the government, or indeed on Parliament. So they think it creates a very, very bad precedent, especially for the future. And so on those grounds, the government should desist from the amendment. More substantively, they see no reason for the amendments to freedom of speech and to the right to property. So on both issues, opposition members don't see why there is a pressing reason for the amendment. There is no, according to them, and according to most sort of neutral observers in the press as well, there is no great threat to public order. There is no great threat to the state security. There is no great threat to zamindari abolition. It is easy enough to rewrite the Bihar laws for them to conform to the constitution. And fourthly, many of them feel that if the government really does need to pass constitutional amendment, it should be circulated widely for public opinion. So on those sort of four major grounds, the amendment is attacked. There is a kind of intervention from the president, Dr. Rajendra Prasad. Again, I quote his letter to Nehru at length in the book. He, again, on similar grounds, sees no need for the amendment, and he again reminds Nehru that fundamental rights, hold a special value and sanctity of their own, and it is a kind of sad reflection on the state of affairs that of all of the things in the constitution, that should be the first part to be attacked and vandalized in this manner. So the debates are very, very heated. There is opposition from across the political spectrum. There is, of course, Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, who one would class as a sort of Hindu nationalist. But crucially, there's opposition from the socialists, figures like Professor K.T. Shah and Shubhan Lal Saxena, Congress stalwarts. There is opposition from conscientious Congress rebels, such as K.K. Bhattacharya, H.V. Kamath, famously, and there is opposition from the kind of liberal figures like Hridaynath Kunzru. In the midst of debate, there is the dramatic resignation of Acharya Kripalani, who savages the amendment and strongly criticizes Nehru on the floor of the House. So it leads to, despite the kind of political capital that Nehru brings to bear, it leads to a certain wavering within the Congress Party. At one Congress Party meeting, 77 MPs present a petition to Nehru asking for a free vote. Nehru, realizing that he can't count on unstinted support of enough members to carry the amendment through, backpedals on one of the parts of the amendment which has generated the most controversy, and that is the imposition of restrictions on the right to freedom of speech. So with many people, starting with Ambedkar, insist that the word reasonable be introduced into the amending bill so that the courts are granted the power to judge whether any laws placing restrictions on the freedom of speech are reasonable or not. This is not something that Nehru wants. He admits to T.T. Krishnamachari that he does not like the word reasonable attached to the word restrictions, because it would be an invitation to the courts to adjudicate on all forms of legislation, but under pressure and under the sort of risk that he might trigger a sort of minor revolt within Congress MPs, he kind of backpedals and allows the word reasonable to be introduced. Famously, during the debate, at one point, the sort of thunderstorm hits New Delhi, and power inside Parliament fails, and it hits so suddenly that many of the MPs are drenched in the rain, and the sort of chamber is plunged into darkness, leading H.V. Kamath to basically say that there is a storm over free speech. or something to the extent that free speech is under threat and there is a storm over it, which is a kind of line behind the title of the book, 16 Stormy Days. In the end, of course, Congress whips suppressed into service, and in the final voting, large numbers of MPs abstain. Very small number, I think 20 odd, vote against the bill, and 200 and about 200 odd vote in favor. So the bill is carried through by a large majority, and the First Amendment is passed, drastically curtailing the freedom of speech, curtailing the right to property, creating something called the Ninth Schedule, which is a schedule appended to the Constitution in which legislation can be placed to make it immune to judicial review. Of course, now with sort of promulgation of the basic structure doctrine, and in certain other certain other cases, that is no longer completely the case. But for many years, for at least 25 odd years, laws placed in the Ninth Schedule were completely immune to judicial review. And then, of course, it enables community-based reservation by, introducing amendments to Articles 15 and also Article 29. Cumulatively, they have, again, as I, describe in the book, they have a sort of effect beyond their, immediately visible content. The revalidation of sedition is something that is particularly relevant in today's day. But also they see the kind of reintroduction of press control acts. Famously in 1952, you have the Press Objectionable Matter Act. You have a series of acts over the years that come to be passed. Sedition, of course, the revalidation of sedition is one of them, but you also have the revalidation of other penal provisions, such as 153A, which is exciting disaffection between classes or groups of people, or something like 295A, which is outraging religious feelings. So you have the revalidation of a series of legal tools which allow the government to kind of influence and direct public discourse. So freedom of speech basically becomes something left to the government's whim, and you see throughout especially the late 50s and the 60s, progressively you have the growth of a certain kind of Nehruvian idealism, or Nehruvian conformism, as I like to call it, which then kind of morphs into the emergency, which famously the historian Gyan Prakash sees as a kind of last gasp of Nehruvian modernity. And the story after that is, everyone knows. So the kind of current context, again, the amendment speaks to the current context in many ways. Sedition, again, is back as a question of discussion, and sedition exists because of the sort of underlying constitutional plumbing being provided by the First Amendment. Ditto for other draconian acts, such as the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, and so on and so forth. The after effects of the First Amendment have been many and very pernicious. It has legitimized a kind of retroactive constitutional, a kind of style of retroactive constitutional amendment to overcome judicial pronouncements. It has it kind of laid the precedent of a easy, almost casual amending of the Constitution, which has happened now well over 100 times. and it kind of Chief Justice Hidayatullah was once heard to quip about the Ninth Schedule that the Indian Constitution is the only one that requires protection against itself. So it also legitimized a kind of it legitimized parliamentary supremacy in a way that the Indian sort of political sphere has never recovered from. It's a kind of parliamentary supremacy that you see in places like Britain, where no written constitution exists. In a recent book, the political theorist Madhav Khosla has suggested that the Indian Constitution was, has had such lengthy codification of foundational principles in order to direct future behavior, to leave very little ground for either politicians or judges to sort of impose their whims and fancies. This story, for example, overturns that narrative. It clearly proves that it was possible for large majorities to bend the constitution in a particular way, and as everyone across from Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, then the leader of opposition, Rajendra Prasad, then President of the Republic, G.V. Mahavankar, then Speaker of Parliament, as all three of them, openly affirm that this amendment basically lays down a precedent that allows for not just for large majorities to bend the constitution in a particular way, but it kind of lays the precedent for the argument that political exigencies or a political agenda trumps the kind of foundational principles of the Republic. And that, I think, has been possibly the most pernicious and the most dangerous and long-running outcome of the First Amendment. So I think I'll kind of stop there and maybe open it up to for you to ask some questions or come into the discussion, and also if there are any other sort of questions and we can maybe clarify some more ideas through that. Would that be fine?
Thank you very much, sir, for this wonderful lecture. So I think the first question would be, you mentioned the after effects of the amendment very clearly during the last part of your speech. Can you tell us about why is it relevant, particularly in India 2020? India is a young country, and there are many people who have, who oppose the government, and dissent is an integral part of a democracy, healthy democracy. So, do you think any after effects on the freedom of speech in India today, especially with the freedom of speech?
Yeah. So, I mean, two major major points. One, of course, is that if you read, I don't know whether if you've read the book, but if you read the book, you'll see that the sort of debates that they're having, the sort of public statements that are being made, the sort of questions that are being discussed are very, very similar. It's just that the tables are turned. At that point in time, it's the Congress which is overwhelmingly, politically dominant, with a larger than life figure as prime minister, and it is the other side which is fighting for what they see as the right to dissent, for the freedom of speech, or for the sanctity of the constitution, and so that is one reason why that story is so important, because as Mukherjee tells Nehru at the end of his speech, he tells him maybe you will rule forever, maybe your future generations after this will rule for the time to come, but just in case that doesn't happen and someone else comes into power, what kind of precedent are you laying down? And so that warning, that sort of almost apocalyptic warning is very important, because as we see today, Mukherjee's words have come true, and the other side is now using the same argument, the very, very same arguments to against the BJP and the RSS that the BJP and that Mukherjee and figures in the RSS were using 70 years ago. So it proves that these are lingering questions. They have, it's something that this sort of contradiction is something that Indian democracy has been grappling with right from the word go, and it's a sort of conflict that we haven't been able to resolve. If anything, there's been a sort of slow slide since 1951 towards a creeping sense of authoritarianism. And I don't think that's particular to any one party or any one political dispensation. I think, and I argue this in my conclusion, partly it's a contradiction in India's transition to democracy, and partly it's a sort of outcome of the very colonial roots of the Indian state. So even the Congress, when it fought the colonial state, didn't really have a sort of any advanced meditation or thinking on democracy and freedom. It laid claim to the entirety of the colonial state. It basically saw itself as a successor to the colonial state, rather than as a sort of upholder of the freedoms and liberties of individual citizens. So that I think that's a trend that exists across the board. So there's there are many precedents to the current situation and current political debates. And secondly, I'll quickly say a couple of sentences on the freedom of speech. You'll notice that the legislation used to target dissenters or to target opponents is generally always kind of finds its way around to Section 124A, to sedition. And sedition is a law that goes back very much to 1951. It was very consciously written out of the Constitution by the founding figures, brought back by the First Amendment, and you can't really understand the kind of thinking behind it until you go back to the First Amendment. So I think that's two main reasons why you would say it's relevant today.
So, do you see a continuous, curve in the freedom of speech since 1951 to the present regime?
Yes. So you'll notice that every time you have a sort of single party rule in the center, you have this kind of pressure of conformity to official discourse. And you saw that in the sort of high point of the Nehruvian period, which is why you're kind of filled with these sort of hagiographic accounts of the early years of the Republic. And the reality was very, very different. And it's only sort of in the recent period that these sort of critical appraisal of that period is coming out. I could recommend a very, very useful book in that regard would be The Indian Ideology by the Marxist historian Perry Anderson. So that I think that period really sets the trend. Of course, you have things kind of go up and down. They're much worse in the emergency than they are after. But broadly, that sort of trend, it's a creeping trend. It's not, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen with one big explosion, and that's why it's important to keep going back to that moment, because it shows you that it is a creeping trend. There's a sort of long precedent for that trend as well. So I don't think the situation now is drastically different to what it was like in 1950, 1951. You have these ups and downs, and I think that's crucial to remember.
Yeah, talking about dissenters, what happened to the propositions made by the dissenters in the parliament, like Mukherjee and Acharya Kriplani, or for that matter, B.R. Ambedkar, who was the father of the Indian Constitution. relating to this amendment of Nehru?
Nothing. So they proposed a number of amendments. All of them were voted down in on the floor of the House. So nothing really. And there was also vociferous criticism outside the House, and that didn't really make any difference either. So it made little difference, and that only proves that large majorities are perfectly capable of bending the constitution to their will.
So, do you think the judiciary was stricter, regarding fundamental rights before the amendment in 1951 than it was after the introduction of the amendment? Was the judiciary sidelined after the introduction of the amendment?
I think the judiciary was kind of shown its place, so to say, by because the amendment it emphasized, again, as I say, a particular kind of parliamentary supremacy that you see generally in places without written constitutions. So somewhere like Britain would be a good example. Um, I quote Chief Justice Kanya at length in the conclusion to the book, where he, more or less says that the weakening of any one leg of the state, whether the judicial, the executive, or the parliamentary leg, can only weaken democracy. And so I think that makes it quite clear that the amendment weakened the judicial leg to a certain extent. Of course, there have since then, things have changed, and even the judiciary has clawed back many of the powers that the amendment took away from them. And in this, the judgments in Kesavanand Bharti and later in I.R. Coelho, even in Menka Gandhi, are important, because it took a long time for the court to kind of find its way, for example, find the key to the ninth schedule, or find its way around the power of amendment that the Constitution had granted Parliament. So I'd say, again, it's a mixed bag, but definitely for the next sort of 20-25 years, until the doctrine of basic structure kind of came about, I'd say it did substantially weaken the judiciary.
So, you have written in one of your papers published, I think, this year in February, that where you have drawn parallels between Nehru and Modi,
Hmm.
on supporting the age-old colonial sedition law. So,
Hmm.
how do you see that? How do you think that there are similarities between both the prime ministers?
Uh, I actually think there are many similarities, not just over their support for the sedition law. There is a sort of aversion to a particular kind of to criticism. They are both very hard-nosed political operators. Uh, they are both very, sort of larger-than-life political figures, and they both uh, have the kind of vision and ambition to kind of mold India in their own image. So in those terms, there are many uh, parallels. Equally, they both see themselves as men of action rather than men of philosophy and ideas. They both don't really have any sort of they seek to show results. They seek to show action and show results rather than engage very deeply in a kind of ideological debate. And in all of those terms, there are many similarities. But just talking about freedom of speech and sedition, you only have to have a cursory glance through Nehru's utterances during that period to see that they're very similar. And there was recently a review of my book published in the Telegraph, which made the same point, that the the book brings the legacies of Nehru and Modi, very almost uncomfortably close for their constituencies, which is true. Any dispassionate analysis would show that.
There's a question from Abhishek Datta that do you think Nehru's complaints about the press circulating misinformation were most genuine or an attempt to suppress legitimate criticism?
Uh, I think I'd say most people believed at that point, the judiciary, the press, the opposition, and many figures within the Congress believed that it was an attempt to stifle genuine criticism. And this came not just through the sort of right-leaning press, which saw Nehru's attack on the freedom of speech as essentially an attack on them, but also from the other side. So if it had been a purely partisan sort of opposition, you might have been able to legitimately claim that this was driven by a fear of misinformation. And misinformation, again, is a kind of loaded term. You can never quite tell where to draw the line. But there was bipartisan opposition to it. So opposition by figures like Jayaprakash Narayan, Acharya Kripalani, H.V. Kamath, H.N. Kunzru, and also opposition from the legal fraternity. You see it from some of India's top lawyers, a number of bar associations, from the All India Newspaper Editors Conference, crucially also from figures like the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, who today would probably think not once but 10 times before taking a stand on an issue so politically charged. So I'd say it was probably a mixture of the two. I wouldn't say it was driven purely by a motive, by purely selfish motives. I'm sure there is the idea that the press was spreading some form of misinformation, but that's again a very old fear. That's what the colonial state feared. That's what Nehru feared. That's again primary contemporary concerns over fake news echo the same sort of fears, and it's attacking that sort of misinformation through legal means inevitably also is inevitably used by governments to stifle criticism of themselves. So that's I think it's a mixture of the two.
So to end this session, one fitting question would be, how liberal is Indian democracy, in the present context, and how do you see the future of democracy in India?
Interesting question. I'll go out on a limb, and I'd say Indian democracy was never very liberal. Liberalism was a kind of outlier mainly because not even again, this is a point made by many historians, Sunil Khilani, Perry Anderson, even Gyan Prakash, that in the kind of social revolutionary strand both in the constitution, within the Congress, and within the kind of Indian nationalist movement more generally, always trumped any commitment to liberalism and democracy. So democracy was a kind of, or liberal democracy, should I say, was a kind of outlier in Indian political thought. There was no one who could be, apart from sort of isolated figures like Kunzru and Kamath, and there was never any sort of great commitment to liberal democracy. There was commitment to democracy, and especially in Nehru's time, a kind of very pedantic commitment to democratic procedures, but never any real commitment to liberalism per se. So, and the social revolutionary strand was by its very nature based on coercion. And Gyan Prakash's work on the emergency is very interesting in tracing back the roots of the emergency to Nehruvian modernity. In that coercion was almost built into the sort of the kind of social agenda of both of the Congress, and that was kind of enshrined in the Constitution. So the Indian state never shied away from coercion. It didn't. They wrote preventive detention into the Constitution. They didn't shy away from using it. The First Amendment, of course, sort of enshrined a certain kind of a liberalism into it. So they've never really. I don't think there's ever been a sort of critical mass of support for liberalism in the traditional sense. I think democracy itself is held out mainly because of the kind of periodically you've seen the rise of sort of rule, and periodically you've seen the kind of slide back towards multi-party rule, which forms its own system of checks and balances. But in terms of liberalism as it's understood, across the world, I don't think there's ever been a very critical mass of support for it. So I don't think Indian democracy was ever very liberal.
What about the future of Indian democracy? How do you see it?
I don't think there's a threat to democracy per se, but I would certainly say that Indian liberalism seems to be a bit of a dying tradition, and whether it survives in its present form or not, we'll have to see. I think democracy kind of throws open changes to the political order when we least expect it, and I think that sort of acts as a corrective in and of its own accord. So I don't think anyone, as Shyam Prasad Mukherjee told Nehru, your rule is not going to be eternal, and so I don't think anyone's rule is going to be eternal. And democracy itself will throw up an alternative at some point.
So thank you very much, Dr. Singh, for your time and for this wonderful lecture and post-lecture discussion. It was truly enlightening and very enriching for all of us, because it is very important to know that when we are in the present, we cannot escape the past, and most of the roots of our problem of today's India lies in the past, and it is very important to examine those. So thank you very much, sir, for your time and for this wonderful lecture.
No, thank you very much for having me, and I hope everyone who listened to it found it interesting, if not enlightening. And yeah, you're doing a great job. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone who joined us live. This lecture will be available on our YouTube channel, so don't forget to subscribe it. Thank you.
Thank you.